The nervous system, the cerebral cortex. The cerebrum is covered by a continuous layer of gray matter that wraps around either side of the forebrain, the cerebral cortex. This thin, extensive region of wrinkled gray matter is responsible for the higher functions of the nervous system. A gyrus or gyri is the ridge of one of those wrinkles, and a sulcus or sulci is the groove between two gyri. The pattern of these folds of tissues indicates specific regions of the cerebral cortex. The head is limited by the size of the birth canal, and the brain must fit inside the cranial cavity of the skull. Extensive folding in the cerebral cortex enables more gray matter to fit into this limited space. If the gray matter of the cortex were peeled off the cerebrum and laid out flat, its surface area would be roughly equal to 1 square meter. The folding of the cortex maximizes the amount of gray matter in the cranial cavity. During embryonic development, as the Diencephalon expands within the skull, the brain goes through a regular course of growth that results in everyone's brain having a similar pattern of folds. The surface of the brain can be mapped on the basis of the locations of large gyri and sulci. Using these landmarks, the cortex can be separated into 4 major regions or lobes. The lateral sulcus that separates the temporal lobe from the other regions is one such landmark. Superior to the lateral sulcus are the parietal lobe and frontal lobe, which are separated from each other by the central sulcus. The posterior region or the cortex is the occipital lobe, which has no obvious anatomical border between it and the parietal or temporal lobes on the lateral surface of the brain. From the medial surface, an obvious landmark separating the parietal and occipital lobes is called the parietal occipital sulcus. The fact that there is no obvious anatomical border between these lobes is consistent with the functions of these regions being interrelated. The Diencephalon. The Diencephalon is a deep beneath the cerebrum and constitutes the walls of the third ventricle. The Diencephalon can be described as any region of the brain with thalamus in its name. The 2 major regions of the diencephalon are the thalamus itself and the hypothalamus. There are other structures such as the epithalamus, which contains the pineal gland, or the subthalamus, which includes the subthalamic nucleus that is part of the basal nuclei. Thalamus. The thalamus is a collection of nuclei that relay information between the cerebral cortex and the periphery, spinal cord, or brainstem. All sensory information, except for the sense of smell, passes through the thalamus before processing by the cortex. For example, the portion of the thalamus that receives visual information will influence what visual stimuli are important or what receives attention. The cerebrum also sends information down to the thalamus, which usually communicates motor commands. This involves interactions with the cerebellum and other nuclei in the brainstem. The cerebrum interacts with the basal nuclei, which involves connections with the thalamus. The primary output of the basal nuclei is to the thalamus, which relays that output to the cerebral cortex. The cortex also sends information to the thalamus that will then influence the effects of the basal nuclei. Hypothalamus. Inferior and slightly anterior to the thalamus is the hypothalamus, the other major region of the Diencephalon. The hypothalamus is a collection of nuclei that are largely involved in regulating homeostasis. The hypothalamus is the executive region in charge of the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system through its regulation of the anterior pituitary gland. Other parts of the hypothalamus are involved in memory and emotion as part of the limbic system. Brainstem. The midbrain and hindbrain, composed of the pons and the medulla, are collectively referred to as the brain stem. The structure emerges from the ventral surface of the forebrain as a tapering cone that connects the brain to the spinal cord. Attached to the brainstem, but considered a separate region of the adult brain, is the cerebellum. The midbrain coordinates sensory representations of the visual, auditory, and somatosensory perceptual spaces. The pons is the main connection with the cerebellum. The pons and the medulla regulate several crucial functions, including the cardiovascular and respiratory system and rates. The cranial nerves connect through the brainstem and provide the brain with the sensory input and motor output associated with the head and neck, including most of the special senses. The major ascending and descending pathways between the spinal cord and brain, specifically the cerebrum, pass through the brainstem. Midbrain, one of the original regions of the embryonic brain. The midbrain is a small region between the thalamus and pons. It is separated into the tectum and tegmentum from the Latin words for roof and floor, respectively. The cerebral aqueduct passes through the center of the midbrain such that these regions are the roof and floor of that canal. Pons. The word pons comes from the Latin word for bridge. It is visible on the anterior surface of the brainstem as the thick bundle of white matter attached to the cerebellum. The pons is the main connection between the cerebellum and the brainstem. The bridge-like white matter is only the anterior surface of the pons. The gray matter beneath that is a continuation of the tegmentum from the midbrain. Gray matter in the tegmentum region of the pons contains neurons receiving descending input from the forebrain that is sent to the cerebellum. Medulla. The medulla is the region known as the Diencephalon in the embryonic brain. The initial portion of the name myle refers to the significant white matter found in this region, especially on its exterior, which is continuous with the white matter of the spinal cord. The tegmentum of the midbrain and pons continues into the medulla because this gray matter is responsible for processing cranial nerve information. A diffuse region of gray matter throughout the brainstem, known as the reticular formation, is related to sleep and wakefulness, such as general brain activity and attention. The cerebellum. The cerebellum, as the name suggests, is the little brain. It is covered in gyri and sulci, like the cerebrum, and looks like a miniature version of that part of the brain. The cerebellum is largely responsible for comparing information from the cerebrum with sensory feedback from the periphery through the spinal cord. It accounts for approximately 10% of the mass of the brain.